Welcome to the Biology 182 Evolution series. This video will provide an overview of evolution and the history of evolutionary change by natural selection. At the end of this video, students should be able to identify the principles of natural selection and to understand the various paradigms that preceded Darwin's theory of natural selection. A species is a group of one type of organism. For example, human beings, or Homo sapiens, are of course the species that we belong to. If we look at the image at the bottom right corner, we can see various species of organisms, including birds, lizards, flowers, insects, etc. Each species has a distinct form and is separated from all other species by its ability to interbreed with other members of its species. The interbreeding must provide viable and fertile offspring. Viability is the ability of an organism to survive or just being alive. Fertility is the ability to reproduce. Each species is made up of groups that consist of the same type of organism living in the same area during the same time frame. These clusters of organisms are a subset of the whole species. So all of the organisms of one type make up the species, and each subset of that species living in one area at the same time is known as the population. If we look at the image in the bottom left corner, we see a series of happy-faced spiders. They are all the same species of spider, but they are individuals from various populations of the species. In other words, each type of spider is found in a different habitat or area. Evolution is simply a change occurring in a species over time. This change must stem from a heritable trait, or one which is passed on from parents to offspring. The characteristic must be expressed in at least two variations through the species. Micro regards changes on a very small scale. So when we study microevolution, we're looking at only visible traits and identifying the change in the frequency of one allele or one gene in a population. This change in genotype or frequency of alleles in the population is studied from one generation to the next. Macro, conversely, looks at large-scale change. When studying macroevolution, we're looking at the species level, not the population level. So as microevolution changes accumulate over time, they can lead to the creation of new species, which is demonstrating macroevolution. Before the late 1700s, scientists held the belief that organisms or life forms were unchanging throughout time. Aristotle postulated that each species contained identical individuals created by some higher being or power. That each type of organism was fixed forever in that one style with no alterations possible. With the advent of empirical thought in the 1600s, the religious beliefs were removed from science and instead were weighed by observational evidence. In the late 1700s, scientists started to challenge the accepted paradigm of life being unchanging. George Buffon was a French zoologist and a naturalist that proposed the opposite, that living things do change over time. Buffon timidly challenged the core beliefs of the time by allowing his natural history accounts, published in his Historia Naturale, to encompass the new view of organisms changing throughout the discussion of biota and abiota observed during his time. Buffon also challenged the beheld belief by describing the idea of organisms of the past being lost in current times. His ideas led to the acceptance of such newfound principles by subsequent French scientists like Lamarck. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was a French biologist in the early 1800s that proposed the evolutionary idea of acquired characteristics, also known as Lamarckianism. In his idea, he believed that traits were desirable based on a certain habitat, and those traits could be acquired during a parent's lifetime and then passed on to their offspring. Lamarck believed, for example, that giraffes that were living in an area with plenty of trees would eat the leaves off the trees of the lower branches. But as the leaves became scarce, the giraffes would stretch their necks to reach the leaves that were higher up. Over time, as the giraffes continued to stretch their necks, they would eventually acquire substantial elongated necks, reaching all the leaves, and pass those long necks on to their offspring. This would be like saying, if I dyed my hair green to blend in with the bushes and grass, I would eventually be able to have green-haired babies. Or if I lifted enough weights for the last 30 years, I would be able to make muscle babies. In the early 19th century, Cuvier proposed catastrophism, where species were killed off by some catastrophic incident, which could only be seen in the fossil record, having vanished them entirely from the earth. He erroneously believed that this stability, followed by extinctions, led to new species being formed. He tried to conform the scientific principles along with the religious beliefs held of the time, including the age of the Earth being only 6,000 years old, and he strongly opposed the belief in gradual change over time, as he thought comparative anatomy demonstrated. In the mid-1800s, Lyell and Hutton discounted catastrophic change and instead embraced uniformitarianism, as shown through the gradual changing of the Earth over large spans of geological time, far more than 6,000 years. They felt that all of nature was gradually changed over time. Eventually, these ideas were embraced by Darwin, who wondered if the Earth could change slowly over large amounts of time. Why couldn't life and species as well? Darwin also expanded the idea from Malthus's work in population genetics, which is simply studying the variation of genes and genotypes in a population. Malthus showed humans have a potential for exponential growth, but are limited by resources like space, food, shelter, disease, and war. Darwin wondered if this included animals. Using the ideas with Mendel's advancements in genetic pea plant findings, it helped Darwin to answer and challenge the questions of the existing paradigm. In addition to shifts in thinking, his travels as a naturalist on the marine vessel the Beagle, Darwin studied life in the Galapagos, leading him to deduce the theory of natural selection. Darwin observed predictable patterns among organisms between the various islands based on the food and habitats available. One such species has become known as Darwin's finches. He noted that the finches of one species had a variation in the size of their beaks. This variation led to the finches exploiting various food sources. The larger, thicker beaks were great for cracking nuts and seeds, while the smaller, thinner beaks were adept at picking up berries or insects. Over the seasons, Darwin noticed that during a particularly dry season, nuts and seeds would be plentiful. The birds more suited to cracking the nuts and the seeds were able to eat and survive better. They were able to reproduce more than the birds with thin beaks who couldn't crack open the nuts or seeds. This led to the next generation, with its new offspring having more large, hard beaks, shifting the frequency of that trait's alleles in the population. The observations during a particularly rainy or wet season yielded more berries and insects. In turn, the birds with longer, thinner beaks found lots of food and were more likely to survive and reproduce more than the ones with large, hard beaks that couldn't reach the insects or the berries in the plants. The population with its new offspring had more small, thin beaks than before, transitioning to a different allele frequency. Darwin wrote a manuscript about his observations and theories, but did not publish for fear of the rejection of his ideas by the scientific community. Alfred Wallace was also a naturalist working and deduced the same principles of evolution through natural selection as Darwin had. While studying organisms on the Malay archipelago between Australia and Asia, Wallace found patterns among different organisms separated by an imaginary line between the continents. Wallace also wrote a manuscript and sent it to Darwin for preview before publication. Lyell read the excerpts from Darwin's book and Wallace's paper and read them to the Linnean Society of Scientists. After this, Wallace and Darwin published a joint paper of their findings. All of this was the motivation Darwin needed to publish his own seminal book on the origin of the species. Although Wallace and Darwin came to the same conclusions independently, Darwin is the household name credited with the theory of evolution by natural selection, and even Wallace downplayed his own contributions, referring to the natural selection ideas as Darwinism. Subsequently, in the early 1900s, another theory arose of blended inheritance. This postulated that as organisms mate, they would produce offspring that were a blending of the traits or an intermediary between the parents. So if a tall man and a short woman had a child together, their child would be a medium height between the two parents. Or if a dark-skinned and light-skinned individual mate, they would have tan-skinned babies. Today, this is actually understood to be polygenic inheritance, where more than one gene is contributing to the effect or the phenotype of a trait. It is continuous in a range of expressions, with eye color, height, hair color, skin color, not just simply expressing a trait of A or B. This and other theories arose from rejections stewing about natural selection. Finally, in the 1940s, evolution by means of natural selection was accepted as the current paradigm, which is still what is accepted today. In order for natural selection to be observed in a population, there must be variation in heritable traits among individuals in the population. There must be competition for resources, limiting survival. We must see adaptation of individuals to the resources available, since those with the best traits suited to the environment will survive and are available for reproduction. This works on phenotype. This is also described as survival of the fittest. Finally, the selection of individuals best suited to the environment eventually leads to an evolutionary change in the frequency of alleles in the population. Students should be able to differentiate between species and populations. Students should be able to describe evolution, microevolution, and macroevolution. Students should be able to understand how observation of finches led to Darwin's idea of selection. Students should be able to identify components of the theory of natural selection. And students should be able to describe competing theories that preceded the theory of natural selection.